She was not supposed to be home until Thursday. Eleanor Whitcomb, Lady Ashbrook, had traveled through the night from her aunt's bedside, a dying woman in a cold house in Harrogate, who had by morning decided not to die after all, and arrived at Ashbrook Hall before the kitchen fires were properly laid, before the lamps were trimmed, before anyone had thought to expect her. She came in through the east passage, because the front steps were still slick with frost, and she stood a moment in the dim corridor outside her husband's study with her traveling gloves still on, her trunk not yet carried in, her feet tired from 2 days of hard road and bad sleep. She heard his voice through the study door. The words were clear, and they stopped her where she stood. I never wanted her. A pause. Something shifted in the room. A chair, perhaps, or the sound of a man gathering himself to continue. Eleanor did not continue. She stood in the corridor with her hand already at her glove, and the sentence completed itself in her mind, as plainly as if it had been spoken aloud. She had always known, after all. She had simply never heard it said. She removed the glove from her left hand with the steadiness of someone untying a familiar knot. The ring came off more easily than she expected. It had always been slightly too large. And she held it for a moment in her bare palm. It was a plain gold band. No stone, no engraving. Julian had chosen it himself. She had thought at the time that it was tasteful. Now she set it on the door handle of the study, the small loop of metal resting against the iron with a faint sound that no one inside the room heard. She walked to the housekeeper's room at the end of the corridor, knocked once, and waited. Mrs. Fallow opened the door in her dressing gown, her cap askew, her face arranged at once into the careful blankness of a woman who had spent 30 years not asking questions. "My lady?" she said. "Good morning, Mrs. Fallow," Eleanor said. "I am going to Hollowmere. Please arrange for my trunks to follow. I will send word about which of my personal effects I will need." Mrs. Fallow looked at her for a moment, at her traveling clothes, at the bare left hand, at the steadiness of her face, and said, "Yes, my lady." "There is no urgency," Eleanor said. "This week will do." She was gone before any lamp in the house was lit for the morning. It had been a morning very much like this one. 2 years ago, when Eleanor had stood at the altar of St. Bridget's in the village and made the vows that connected her to Julian Ashbrook. She remembered the cold. She remembered the light falling in from the north windows in long pale bars that made the church feel like a room inside a winter morning rather than a room inside a building. She remembered her father's hand at her elbow, thin, already shaking with what they would not yet call illness, and the particular quality of Julian's attention as she walked toward him, focused, contained, giving nothing away. They had stood side by side and spoken the correct words in the correct order. Julian's voice had been clear and even. Her own voice had been steady. She had been proud of that steadiness. She had worked for it. Afterward, at the wedding breakfast, he had spoken with her father for a long time about something she could not hear from across the room. She had watched his profile and thought, "This man will be a courteous husband. He will manage the estate competently. He will not embarrass me in company or make scenes in private. He will not love me, but he will be fair. But he will." She had believed then that fairness was what she had earned. She had believed then that earning was the right frame for a marriage. The carriage moved through the gray morning, past the elm row at the edge of Ashbrook's grounds, and onto the open road toward the moor. Eleanor did not look back at the house. She watched the road ahead and kept her left hand folded in her lap. And she did not think about the ring on the door handle, or the man who would find it, or the sentence she had heard and not yet heard the end of. She thought instead about the last 2 years with the clarity of someone who has finally stopped trying to make sense of something and started simply seeing it. The dinners where he sat at the far end of the table and addressed himself to whatever guest sat nearest him. The evenings where he retired early to the study. The county assembly where he had danced with her once, correctly, and then not again. The morning she had organized the household accounts and left them on his desk with a note, and received back a note that said, "Only these are accurate, thank you." The way he had looked at her sometimes across a room, quickly and then away, as though she had caught him at something. She had catalogued all of it as confirmation, as the shape of a marriage made from obligation. She had organized her entire life at Ashbrook around the premise that she was there to earn a place she had been given out of duty. The carriage turned south. The moor opened around them, brown and wide and cold, and the first thin light of morning came in sideways across the grass. And Eleanor sat with her hands in her lap and thought, I am done earning. Hollowmere was small, cold, and entirely hers. Her mother had lived here for 8 years after Eleanor's father moved the family to Ashbrook. The dower house, left to Eleanor by her mother's will. A modest stone building with 4 proper rooms and a kitchen that smelled of damp wood and old fires. The housekeeper had been given notice 2 years ago when Eleanor married and went to Ashbrook. The rooms had been closed since then. Eleanor opened them herself, pushing back the shutters one by one and letting the gray morning light in. And she stood in the middle of her mother's sitting room and breathed the cold air, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could calculate, that she was standing on ground that belonged to her. She moved through the rooms, taking stock. The furniture was draped in holland covers. The kitchen range needed blacking. The windows in the back bedroom had let in a seam of damp along the sill, and the plaster above it had gone soft. She noted these things with the same precision she had brought to Ashbrook's household accounts, and she felt a grim satisfaction in the noting, because these were problems she could solve with her own resources and her own decisions, no one else's permission. It was in the sitting room, examining the writing desk that had been brought ahead from Ashbrook on her instruction, a piece she had always considered her own, a slender walnut desk that had been her mother's, that she found the drawer. The bottom left drawer would not open. She tried it twice, then looked more carefully, and saw the small brass keyhole she had never noticed before. She ran her hand along the underside of the lid, feeling for what did not belong, and found the key taped there with a strip of cloth, small, flat, warm from the wood. She stood for a moment with the key in her hand. Then she put it in the lock and turned it. Inside the drawer, tied with a plain cord, was a packet of letters, perhaps 30 of them, each folded and sealed with plain wax, each dated in a hand she recognized immediately as Julianne's. The same neat, contained script she had seen in 2 years of notes about household matters and estate decisions. She picked up the first letter. The date on the seal was from the week of their wedding. She broke the wax carefully and unfolded it. My dear, I do not know how to begin a marriage that began as an account settled. I have been trying to think how to tell you something that I should have told you before the ceremony. And I find that every sentence I begin leads me to a place I cannot take you without making you feel something I do not wish you to feel. So instead, I will say this. I hope, in time, to be worthy of what you have given up. I am aware it is more than you have said. She read it 3 times. She sat in the cold sitting room with the letter in her hands and the rest of the packet on the desk beside her. And the lamp she had lit burned slowly down, and she did not sleep. 3 days later, Hollowmere was in better order. Eleanor had found a woman in the village, a widow named Agnes Marsh, who had been housekeeper to the rector for 12 years and knew how to manage a cold house without ceremony. And between them, they had blacked the range, aired the bedrooms, and made the sitting room habitable. Eleanor wrote to her solicitor in York, a careful and precise letter laying out what she required. An accounting of her mother's income from the small property attached to Hollowmere, clarification of the terms of the will, and guidance on what steps she might take to establish herself independently. She wrote these letters at the walnut desk, with the packet of Julian's unsent letters in the locked drawer beneath her. And she worked with the focused attention of a woman who has discovered that she is more capable than she was permitted to believe. The solicitor's reply came on the 5th day. Mr. Hartley was a careful man, and his letter was careful, but the complication it contained was not. My lady, I must draw your attention to a condition of the original settlement on Hollowmere. The dower income, amounting to some £180 per annum, passes to you in full upon your mother's death, as you know. However, a clause in the settlement specifies that in the event of a living marriage, the income remains under the administration of your husband's estate, unless a formal declaration of separation, signed by both parties or adjudicated by a magistrate, is lodged with the court within 6 weeks of your departure from the marital home. We are now 5 days into that period. I advise you to act with some urgency. Eleanor set the letter down on the desk and looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote to Mr. Hartley to say that she understood the situation and would act accordingly. 6 weeks. She had 6 weeks to secure what was hers. At Ashbrook Hall, Julian Ashbrook found the ring on the morning of Eleanor's departure. When he came out of his study to ask for breakfast, he stood in the corridor for a long time with the ring in his hand. Then he went back into the study and read the note that had been left with Mrs. Fallow. A single line in Eleanor's precise hand. I heard enough. I am gone to Hollowmere. He settled into the chair nearest the cold grate and held the ring and the note together, and he did not move for the better part of an hour. She knew then. She had heard, she must have heard, and she had drawn the only conclusion available to her. He had been a fool to speak aloud in an unlocked room, and the particular cruelty of it was that what she had heard was not what he had meant, and he had no way of knowing how much she had heard or how little. He went to his desk. He took out paper. He wrote 3 sentences and crossed them out. He wrote a paragraph and read it back and saw that it sounded like a man explaining himself out of cowardice rather than honesty. He started again. He wrote for an hour, and at the end of the hour he had 4 pages that said everything. The debt, the reasoning, Lady Margaret's words, his own wretched performance of indifference. And he folded them and did not send them, because what he had written required her to read it in a room with him present, so that she could look at his face and know whether he was telling the truth. And she had not invited him. In the evenings at Hollowmere, Eleanor read 1 letter from the packet. She read them in order, as though they were chapters of a book she had not known existed. Julian had written them regularly, sometimes weekly, sometimes with gaps of a month. Over the full 2 years of their marriage, the handwriting was always the same. Controlled at the beginning of each letter, and looser by the final page, as though the act of writing had gradually undone whatever restraint he brought to the opening. The man who wrote these letters was precise and tender, and frightened in ways she had never seen him be frightened. He wrote about the estate with the same fluency she knew from his public manner, but the estate was always a prelude to something else. To a sentence about the way she had arranged the flowers in the hall that morning, or the quality of her attention when someone spoke to her at dinner, or the way she had handled the estate agent's rudeness at the autumn accounting with a composure that made Julian feel, he wrote, ashamed of every false thing I have shown you. She read these letters as a stranger reads a diary found in a rented house. The man on the pages was not the man she had lived beside for 2 years. Or rather, she was beginning to understand, with a growing unease that had nothing to do with grief. He was exactly that man, and she had simply never been given access to the room where he actually lived. It was on the evening of the fourth letter that she allowed herself to remember the funeral. Her father had died in the January of their first year of marriage. The churchyard had been frozen, the ground hard under the snow, and she had stood at the graveside with her hands folded and her face composed in the way her mother had taught her. And she had not wept because weeping at gravesides was not what women in her family did. Julian had stood beside her. He had not spoken. And at some point during the committal, without a word, he had removed his coat and laid it across her shoulders. She had catalogued it, at the time, as duty, as the correct performance of a husband's role. She was beginning to wonder if she had been wrong about what duty looked like, and what it did not. Lady Margaret Thrushcross called at Ashbrook 3 weeks into Eleanor's absence. She arrived in a carriage with her crest on the door, and was received in the drawing-room, which Julian had not used since Eleanor left, and which still held the particular stillness of a room that has been properly arranged and then abandoned. "You look dreadful," Lady Margaret said, with the brisk sympathy of a woman who has delivered difficult truths for so long that she has mistaken it for kindness. "Thank you, Margaret," Julian said. "She is at Hollowmere, I understand. Has she written?" "No," he said quietly. Lady Margaret settled herself into the chair nearest the fire. I had wondered how long it would take. She was always a composed creature, but composed women have limits. I imagined the isolation of this marriage was eventually going to tell. Julian looked at her steadily. "The isolation of this marriage," he said, "is my responsibility." "Well," Lady Margaret said, "you did what you could with what you had. The match was always going to be a strain. She is a baronet's daughter. You are an earl. The distance was always there, whatever anyone said about her qualities." Julian did not answer. He looked at the fire. "I think," Lady Margaret continued, "that you should allow a decent interval and then begin the practical conversations. She is a sensible woman. She will understand that a separation, properly managed, is better for both." "I am going to Hollowmere," Julian said. Lady Margaret paused. "Julian." "Not today," he said, "but I am going." Eleanor's letter arrived at Ashbrook on the 21st day of her absence. It was not what Julian had expected. It was not a demand, and it was not an explanation, and it was not an accusation. It was, in its entirety, one question, written in her careful hand on a single sheet. "Did you know that I never knew?" He read it standing at his desk, still in his riding coat from the morning's work. He read it twice. Then he took out paper and wrote back. And this time he did not cross anything out, because there was nothing to cross out. There was only one honest answer. He wrote, "I did not," and signed it with his initials. He sent it that afternoon. 3 days later, he saddled his horse himself, without calling for the groom, and rode to Hollowmere. Agnes Marsh opened the door, looked at him. No crested carriage, no announcement. A man on horseback in a plain coat with mud on his boots, and said, "Lady Ashbrook is not receiving visitors." Julian sat on his horse for a moment. "Please tell her I'm here." Agnes Marsh went inside. She returned 90 seconds later. "Lady Ashbrook says she is not receiving visitors." He rode back to the inn at the village and took a room. He returned 3 days later and was received at the door with the same answer in the same words. He rode back to the inn. He spent the evening writing in the same way he had spent evenings for 2 years, with a candle and a piece of paper and the truth arranged in sentences that he now, finally, intended to deliver. On the third visit, the door opened, and it was Eleanor herself who stood in it. Not Agnes Marsh, but Eleanor, in a plain gray dress with ink on her fingers and her hair simply dressed. And she looked at him with an expression he could not immediately read. "The kitchen," she said. The kitchen at Hollowmere was small and warm from the range, and it smelled of bread and wood smoke. Eleanor stood on one side of the scrub table, and Julian stood on the other, and neither of them moved to sit. She looked at him across the table. He was thinner than she remembered. Or perhaps it was only that she was seeing him in plain daylight, without the architecture of a great house arranged around him. "You rode without a carriage," she said. "Yes," he said. "And without announcing yourself." "Yes," he said again. "Why?" Julian set his hat on the table beside him. "Because I did not think I had the right to arrive as Lord Ashbrook," he said. "I thought I had the right only to arrive as myself. And I was not certain that was enough." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "Your answer?" she said. "3 words. They were the only true ones I had." "They may have been," Eleanor said. "But 3 words after 2 years is not a conversation. It is a footnote." She moved to the table, not sitting, but setting both hands flat on it. And he saw the ink stains on her fingers and the absence of the ring. "I need you to understand something before we speak further," she said. "The question I'm asking is not whether you love me. I have read enough of what you wrote to understand that you do. The question is whether I can become someone who did not spend 2 years waiting for permission to be worth loving. Because I am not certain that woman exists yet. And I will not go back to Ashbrook to look for her." Julian did not argue. He did not speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice was careful and direct in a way she had not heard from him before. "Will you read something," he said, "that I should have given you 2 years ago?" He took a folded paper from his coat and set it on the table between them. Eleanor looked at it. She did not pick it up immediately. "Tell me first," she said. "Tell me what it says." He told her about her father's debts and how he had learned of them. Through a mutual acquaintance in the banking crisis. Through the kind of information that moves quietly in the world of men who manage money and estates. He told her about the hidden sister, a young woman who had required medical care for years, whose existence her father had concealed from everyone outside the immediate family, and whose bills had quietly destroyed everything he had built. He told her that he had paid every debt anonymously, through a third party, because he had not wanted her father to know it was him. "I intended," he said, "to offer marriage afterward, not because of the debt. Because I had—" He paused. "Because I had wanted to for some time. But I could not offer it before the debts were settled, because if I had, you would have been accepting a man who knew your family's ruin and had done nothing. And I could not offer it by disclosing what I had done, because then you would have been accepting a man who had rescued you. And I did not want your acceptance on those terms." Eleanor listened. She did not move. "Lady Margaret came to me," he said, 3 weeks before the wedding. "She told me that you had guessed, or would guess, what I had done. She told me—" He stopped. "She told me that you would never love a man you pitied. That gratitude dressed as consent was the best I could expect. That if I wished to spare you the humiliation of feeling obligated, I should perform indifference, make it clear, by manner, that the marriage was a practical arrangement on both sides, so that you would not feel you owed me feeling." The kitchen was very quiet. "And you believed her," Eleanor said. "I believed her," he said. Because I was afraid, and because she gave me a reason to be cowardly that sounded like consideration for you. Eleanor turned away from the table. She went to the window and looked out at the gray garden for a moment. The dead grass, the bare hedge, the sky the color of cold water. Then she turned back. She told me, Eleanor said, in almost the same week, that you had always found the match a strain, that you were doing your duty by a woman below your station, and that I should not expect warmth from a man in your position. She picked up the paper he had set on the table and held it without opening it. She built the same wall from both sides, she said, and we each stood behind it and believed the other had put it there. Julian watched her face. I have been reading your letters, she said. The ones in the drawer. I know, he said. You sent the desk deliberately. He was quiet for a moment. I sent it because it was yours, he said. I did not know whether you would find the drawer. I did not know whether I wanted you to. But I could not burn them. And I could not keep them at Ashbrook and know they were there, unread, for the rest of whatever this is. Eleanor set the folded paper down, went to the sitting room, and returned with the full packet of his letters tied with their cord. She placed them on the table between them. Sit down, she said. He sat. She sat across from him. She untied the cord. She opened the letter dated from the second month of their marriage, the one she had read 4 times the previous evening, and found the passage she had marked with a fold. She read it aloud, her voice even. I do not know how to come into a room where you are without becoming smaller. I do not mean that you diminish me. I mean that I diminish myself. I arrange myself into something manageable, something that will not ask too much of you. And by the time I have finished the arrangement, there is very little left of what I actually wanted to say. She finished reading. She set the letter down. Julian had not moved while she read. His hands were flat on the table. She looked at them, at the ringless right hand, the plain cuff, the particular stillness of a man who has decided to stop managing himself. And then he reached across the table and turned her left hand over, gently palm upward, and rested his over it. She did not pull away. The storm came in from the north at dusk, the kind of Yorkshire storm that means business, that turns the sky the color of iron and makes the moorland roads impassable in under an hour. Agnes Marsh looked out the kitchen window at the sky and said, with the pragmatic tone of a woman who has lived through 40 Yorkshire winters, that no sensible person would ride in it. Julian looked at Eleanor. You may sleep in the back bedroom, Eleanor said. The plaster is damp above the window, but the bed is made. Agnes Marsh found reasons to be elsewhere. And Eleanor built up the kitchen fire, and they sat on opposite sides of it with the packet of letters on the table between them. We have, by my count, 11 left, Eleanor said. 12, Julian said. I kept the order. Then we will read them in order. They did. They read in turn, one each, passing the letters across the table. And the storm pressed against the windows, and the fire burned steadily, and the kitchen was the warmest room either of them had occupied in what felt like a very long time. Julian read the letter from the October of their first year, about the night she had sat up with the tenant farmer's wife during a difficult labor, and come home at dawn with blood on her cuffs and gone straight to the kitchen to make tea, and how he had watched from the doorway without announcing himself and thought, he had written, that you are the most capable person I have ever known, and I have spent 10 months pretending not to notice. Eleanor read the letter from the following spring, about the assembly where they had danced once, and he had not asked her again because she had not smiled at him during the first dance, and he had concluded, incorrectly, that she found it tedious. I was nervous, she said, setting the letter down. I know that now, he said. I practiced not smiling because I thought... She stopped. I thought if I appeared too pleased, you would think I was performing gratitude. Julian looked at her across the fire. We were both, he said, performing the wrong things for exactly the same reason. Eleanor picked up the next letter. She read it through. When she reached the final paragraph, the passage about coming into a room and becoming smaller, about arranging himself into something manageable, until nothing remained of what he had meant to say. She closed the letter. She stood up from her chair, crossed the rug, and sat beside him on the bench. She did not take his hand. But she was close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and when he reached for the next letter from the table, she did not move away. They read the last 3 letters together, side by side, with the fire burning low and the storm spending itself against the stone walls of Hollowmere. And when the final letter was read, Eleanor folded it carefully and placed it with the others, and they sat in the quiet that followed without filling it. She went upstairs to her own room at midnight. He sat by the dying fire for a long time after, listening to the rain. Dawn came gray and still. Julian rose early, dressed in the cold back bedroom, and came downstairs to find the kitchen empty and the range already warm. Agnes Marsh had been in before him. He stood at the kitchen table and looked at the packet of letters, neatly retied with their cord, and at his own hat on the chair beside the door. He picked up the hat. He was at the threshold, the door half open, the cold morning air coming in, the yard still wet from last night's rain, when he heard footsteps on the stairs. Eleanor came down in her morning dress, her hair not yet properly pinned, and she stopped on the bottom step when she saw him at the door. He turned. He had his hat in his hand, and mud still on his boots, and the morning light was the plain, unsparing light of a Yorkshire dawn, and there was nothing between them. No candlelight, no social occasion, no performance of any kind. I was not invited to stay, he said. No, she agreed. He nodded once, accepting this, and turned back to the door. Julian. He stopped. She came down the last step and crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and kissed him. It was not tentative, and it was not a question. It was the first real kiss of their marriage, in plain morning light, with no performance in it on either side. And when she stepped back, she looked at him with an expression that was neither the composed distance he had known at Ashbrook, nor anything he could have anticipated, but something entirely her own. You may come back on Saturday, she said, if you wish to. I wish to, he said. As my guest, she said. On my terms. Yes, he said. On your terms. He put his hat on and walked out into the wet morning, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him go, and did not go back inside until the sound of his horse had faded down the lane. The 6-week deadline arrived on a Tuesday. Eleanor was at the walnut desk when Mr. Hartley's clerk came with the papers, and she signed them in the sitting room with Agnes Marsh as witness, and the clerk as the second required signatory. The dower income, £180 per annum, was now secured in her name alone. She thanked the clerk, offered him tea, which he declined, and showed him out. She stood for a moment in the sitting room after the door closed. The resolution was hers, not the marriage's, not Julian's, hers. She had walked out of Ashbrook Hall with nothing but her traveling clothes and her mother's house, and she had rebuilt the practical architecture of her own life in 6 weeks. And the ground she was standing on now was ground she had claimed herself. She went back to the desk and picked up the letters she had been writing when the clerk arrived. It was not to her solicitor. It was to Julian, who had come to Hollowmere on the Saturday, as she had invited, and the Saturday after that, and who had spent 3 hours on the second visit helping her assess the damp in the back bedroom, with the same focused competence he brought to everything practical, and who had left both times when she indicated the visit was concluded, without pressing for more. She finished the letter and sealed it, and left it on the hall table for the morning post. Months later, Hollowmere. Late autumn again, the second one, the grass gone brown on the moor, the sky pressing low and gray, the lane outside the house soft with fallen leaves. A single candle burned in the sitting-room window. The fire in the kitchen grate was properly built, with good coal, not the damp wood of the first winter. The walnut desk had been moved to the sitting-room, where the light was better, and a letter lay on it, open, half-answered, the ink still wet on the most recent lines. Julian was in the kitchen, making tea badly, in the way of a man who has learned the task recently and has not yet mastered it. He was at Hollowmere 3 days a week now, and sometimes 4. He had not asked Eleanor to return to Ashbrook, and she had not offered. He had asked 2 months ago whether he might bring a case of books from the Ashbrook library that she had mentioned wanting to read, and she had said yes. And the books were now on the shelf in the sitting room alongside her mother's. Eleanor came into the kitchen and took the teapot from him with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has stopped pretending not to notice when something is being done wrong. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She made the tea and poured it and sat across from him, and the kitchen was warm and quiet and entirely ordinary, and they sat with their tea in companionable silence for a while before Julian said, carefully, "I brought something." He set a small box on the table. Eleanor looked at it. She did not open it immediately. "I am not asking you to come back to Ashbrook," Julian said. "I am not asking you to change anything that you have made here. I am asking—" He stopped. "I am asking if you would be willing to wear it again, here, on your terms, as your choice." Eleanor opened the box. The ring was the same plain gold band, but there was something different about it now. And she looked more closely and saw that a single word had been engraved inside the band in small, clean letters. "Chosen." She looked at it for a long moment. Then she took it out of the box and placed it on her own finger, with her own hand, in the warm kitchen at Hollowmere, with the candle burning in the sitting-room window and the tea going cold between them and the late autumn light coming in gray and honest through the glass. Julian looked at her hand. He did not speak. She looked up at him. "You are staying for dinner," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am." Outside, the first of the evening's rain began to move across the moor, soft and steady, the kind that settles in for the night. The candle in the window burned on, and inside Hollowmere, her house, her ground, her chosen life, Eleanor Whitcomb, Lady Ashbrook, poured the tea again and began, for the first time, to speak without choosing her words in advance.